Okay, so now we're going to do question 5 on the Catechism. In what way does God control the world? God is in control of everything that happens and runs the world according to his good and wise will. He does this without overriding our self-will or taking away our responsibility or ever committing evil. Everything he does is for both his glory and the good of those who love him. So, in what way does God control the world? God is in control of everything that happens and runs the world according to his good and wise will. So let's look at Ephesians 1:11. How many things does God work out according to his plan? All things. Great. Okay, let's look at Acts 4:27 to 28. Who ultimately planned the crucifixion? God. Right. Okay. In what way does God control the world? God is in control of everything that happens and runs the world according to his good and wise will. He does this without overriding our self-will or taking away our responsibility. So let's look at Genesis 50, verse 20. So this is Joseph after his brothers had sold him into slavery. And this is what he says. The question is, did God's planning eliminate the brothers' intentions? I have no idea why I worded the question that way. The way it's worded is not nice, but it doesn't flow well. But did God's planning eliminate the brothers' intentions? No. Okay, so he says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. So even though God intended it for good, Joseph still says, you intended to harm me. They're still responsible. Okay, now let's look at James 1:13 to 14. So the question is, do people do evil because God makes them? No. Okay. Why do they do evil? Say that a bit louder, I couldn't hear you. Because of their own evil desires, yeah? Verse 14, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Okay, so in what way does God control the world? God is in control of everything that happens and runs the world according to his good and wise will. He does this without overriding our self-will or taking away our responsibility. And there you've got a picture of a builder. Yeah, and this is one of the stock pictures I actually like. So here you've got a builder, and I'm going to use an illustration by a guy called Lorraine Boatner, or Bettner, I can't remember how you say his name. But basically, this is the story of an architect and builders. So if you think about it, an architect says, this is how I want the building to be. I want the building exactly like this. He designs it how he wants. Then he gets builders. He tells the builders, this is how you're going to do it. He gives the builders exactly the right amount of pay and exactly the right working conditions and materials and everything so that those builders build the building exactly how he wants. So the builders do everything the architect wants, but are the builders acting like robots? They're not, right? Of their own self-will, they're going about saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. At the same time, the architect has said, this is how it's going to be. So the architect is the primary cause of what happens. The builders are the secondary cause, and they do it quite willingly, yet the whole time it's actually the architect who's making it happen. In a similar way, that's how God is with us. He plans out, this is how it's going to be. We end up doing what he's planned, but we do those things with our own self-will. We don't do them as robots. Joseph's brothers weren't acting as robots. They were using their own self-will to do that, and yet at the same time, it was God who had planned it out, and he intended this is how it's gonna be. So God does the primary cause, and we do the secondary cause. Now, notice there's a phrase we use there in the Catechism called self-will. Anyone like to guess why we said self-will and not free will? There's no such thing as free will. Does anyone here like liver? Put your hand up if you like liver. Okay, there's two people who like liver. So for everyone, forget you two people, right? Sorry, but for everyone else, yeah, do you have free will to like liver? No, you can't just be like, you know what, I'm gonna like liver. You can't do that, yeah? You just cannot do it. Your will is not free, okay? You do not have a free will. And the Bible actually teaches that our wills are in bondage to the devil until Jesus sets us free from that. So the Bible doesn't say we have a free will. Now, some clever people have said, yes, you are free to will whatever you want to will. But what do you want to will? And when you're born in sin and born as a slave to the devil, what you want is all bad stuff. You're not free from that. You need Jesus to break you free from it. So we're not using the term free will. There's another reason why people don't use the term free will. First, you've got to define what do you mean by free will. Some people who've done like a theology class, philosophy class at school will say, I'm talking about libertarian free will. Now, we haven't got time to go there, but if such a thing existed, right, then what would happen is when you go to the restaurant, yeah, you got a menu, okay, and you've got a totally free will to pick whatever you want. Guess what? You would never pick anything. Because there's no reason why you would ever go for kung po chicken over sweet and sour. Because you have a totally free will. You're not biased in any way to go for one over the other. You would just look at the menu the whole night and you would go, and you would never pick anything. The other problem with talking about libertarian free will is in a court of law, if someone shot someone, they'd be like, well, why did you shoot them? There's no reasons for doing it because you have a totally free will. There'd never be a reason for why you did that. I've kind of lost my train of thought behind the argument for that one. But anyway, we avoided the term free will and instead we say self-will. And this is significant because our culture is full of the term free will. So in the movies, it happens all the time, innit? People say, but what about free will? Notice as well, Adam and Eve didn't have free will in the garden before the fall because God gives them a command straight away. God says, you can't eat from that one. So straight away, God lets us know the most important thing to God is not free will. Yeah? Because if it was, he'd say, guys, whatever you want, just take it. It's yours, because free will, remember, is the most important thing. God doesn't. Instead, he says, here's the rules, which shows that his rule is way more important than free will. So we've used the term self-will to avoid that. Okay, so back to the Catechism. In what way does God control the world? God is in control of everything that happens and runs the world according to his good and wise will. He does this without overriding our self-will or taking away our responsibility or ever committing evil. Let's look at 1 John 1:5. Why is God not able to commit evil?
Because there's no darkness in him.
Great, there is no darkness in him. He cannot commit evil. We would say that God does use evil for his purposes, but he never commits evil. And we'll come on to examples of that in a minute. So just hold that thought. In what way does God control the world? God is in control of everything that happens and runs the world according to his good and wise will. He does this without overriding our self-will or taking away our responsibility or ever committing evil. Everything he does is for both his glory and the good of those who love him. So let's look at Ephesians 1:11-12. So what is the purpose of God's planning? His glory, right? So in that verse at the end, might be for the praise of his glory. The purpose of his planning is for God's glory, to show how glorious God is. So in what way does God control the world? God is in control of everything that happens and runs the world according to his good and wise will. He does this without overriding our self-will or taking away our responsibility or ever committing evil. Everything he does is for both his glory and the good of those who love him. So let's look that up. Romans 8:18 and verse 28. So what is another purpose of God's planning?
For our good.
For our good, right? So the other one was for God's glory, and now we're seeing glory will be revealed in us, verse 18. And then 28, in all things God works for the good of those who love him. So in what way does God control the world? God is in control of everything that happens and runs the world according to his good and wise will. He does this without overriding our self-will or taking away our responsibility or ever committing evil. Everything he does is for both his glory and the good of those who love him. And so now we've got over the page, we've got some pictures there. First is a picture of Jesus there. When we're talking about this, the easiest way to make sense of it all is Jesus at the cross. Because at the cross, we see that humans did it to Jesus. They killed him, and we know that when they killed him, what they did was wrong. It was a sin. It went against what God said in his word, do not murder, and they're killing God's son. And at the same time, we see that God planned it all, and yet God didn't actually himself commit any evil in the planning of it. And we also see that great good came from it, and that God was glorified from it. So it's a terrible thing that happens, and yet we see God planning it. We see from what we saw in Acts that humans planned, and yet at the same time we also see that God was planning it. We also see here in the cross that there are, in a sense, what we call two wills of God. So one will of God is thou shalt not murder. Another will of God is that God planned for his son to be murdered. So in that sense, you could say there's two wills of God, and we're going to find out more about that when we get to the Winston Churchill illustration. Now, move on to the next picture. This is Joseph, okay? Excuse the stock royalty-free pictures there. It's supposed to be Joseph, and Joseph's a wonderful example, of something really bad happens to him that his brothers plan, and his brothers are responsible for that, and his brothers have committed evil. And yet at the same time, from that badness that goes on, we see that God had a plan to save many people. And in fact, God saved the offspring of the woman through Joseph. The Israelites would have been wiped out in the famine if it wasn't for Joseph. God did it to save many people. It glorified God, and it also ended up being for the good of Joseph and for the good of the Israelites. Now we've got the story of if you look at the picture of the rollerblades, the story here is that there was a little girl. Ray Stedman tells this story. I have no idea if it was true. He says there was a little girl who kept saying, Dad, can I have those rollerblades? But in Ray Stedman's day, it was roller skates. It's like, can I have those rollerblades? And the dad was like, nah, they're too fast for you. She was like, but Dad, please, can I have the rollerblades? He's like, no, they're too fast for you. Dad, please, can I have the rollerblades? Well, one day the dad says, okay, I'll give you the rollerblades. She gets on them, goes down the pavement, full blast, and then she ends up going into the road, and a car hits her and she dies. The rollerblades were too fast for her. Now, in a similar way, there's things we want in our life that God don't give us because he knows that for his glory and for our good, it's better that we don't get them. Some of us have grown up in situations where we've wanted it to be different. And we might have thought, why didn't God make it different? And the reason is for God's glory and for our good. And the other side of eternity, we have a better idea of why all the things worked the way they did. It was all for God's glory and for our good. Now let's turn to Lamentations 3:32 to 33. I'm going to read this verse out again. It's a beautiful verse. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love, for he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone. So the question is, does God willingly bring bad things into our lives? No, he doesn't. He doesn't. So now we come to the story of Churchill. There's pictures of Winston Churchill. You might have heard the story of Winston Churchill in Coventry in World War II. Now there's dispute about whether this is true or not. But the story goes that in World War II, contrary to Hollywood, the Brits cracked the Enigma code, right? So we cracked the Enigma code, which meant this was the uncrackable code the Germans used. It meant that we now, every time the Germans communicated with one another about what they were doing, we knew what they were doing. But of course, once you know that, you don't let the Germans know, oh, by the way, chaps, we've cracked your code. You don't do that, right? You keep it on the down low, okay? Now, what happened was they intercepted communications of the Germans saying that they were planning to bomb Coventry. So Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister then, gets told, we've just found out they're going to bomb Coventry. Winston Churchill has now got a dilemma. He can evacuate Coventry and save the life of everyone in Coventry. But if he does, when the German bomber planes come over and they see that no one's in Coventry, they're going to know that their Enigma code has been cracked. Now, because the Enigma code's been cracked, it now looks like the Brits could win the war. So the Brits and the Allied forces, we could win the war. So Winston Churchill's like, I want to save Coventry, but at the same time, I want to win the war and not save Coventry. Churchill had two wills. One will that no one in Coventry would die, and another will that people in Coventry would die because it would bring about, in the end of the war. And so he allowed Coventry to be bombed. And they say that afterwards he was standing there in Coventry around the wreckage looking at it all. He must have been very sad about that. In a similar way, Lamentation shows us that God doesn't willingly bring affliction. There's things in your life where he's brought them about, not willingly. He's brought them about because he knows it's for your good and it's for his glory. But he knows it hurts you, and he's done it in a sense almost like reluctantly, if I could use an anthropomorphism, on God. God isn't willingly bringing it to your life. And that's really important. When we're talking about how God runs the world, it's really important that we understand that, that God is not willingly bringing affliction into our lives. Now, we've got a picture here of a torch shining into the darkness. Now, check it out. If any of you have read J.I. Packer's book on evangelism, you know that light is made up of what? What's light made up of? We're not really physicists here. It's made up of waves. What's it also made up of? Particles. Now check it out. You cannot have something that's made of waves and particles. Either stuff's made of waves or it's made of particles. So what do physicists do? They're like, what J.I. Packer says in his book, Sovereignty of God. Did I quote it here? I didn't put the full quote in here. Where basically one guy said to him something like, well, what we do is on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we say light is particles. And the other days of the week, we say it's waves. Physicists don't understand how light can be particles and waves at the same time. In a similar way, we don't understand how God is controlling everything in the world according to his will, and at the same time, we are doing stuff, and we're responsible for it. We don't understand how those two things come together. It's interesting, in ancient times, the biblical writers didn't have a problem of it. They always talk in that way. The battle is the Lord's, but they will still go out and fight. How does that work? We would tend to be like, the battle's the Lord's, I'll sit at home and let him sort it out. You think about some of those ancient movies you've seen. Even pagan Greeks are going out to war and they're saying, let's see what the gods will do. The ancient mindset knew that the gods, quote unquote, were in control, and at the same time we've got to do stuff and that we're responsible for our actions. But it's really hard for us with our modern mindsets to get our heads around that. So in some ways we're like this picture of the two twins in the womb. And these two twins are in the room, and one of them says to the other, I don't understand Mum, I mean, she's always jostling us about. Like when I'm hungry and I want to eat, she just starts like bumping me around the whole time. And come to think of it, I've never even seen Mum. I mean, does she really exist? I mean, if there was a Mum, wouldn't she just like take care of me exactly the way I want to be taken care of all the time? And what's with these funny vibrations every now and then and the noises? Well, what he doesn't know is that when he's hungry, Mum is getting up and going to eat to make sure she's got enough food so that baby has enough food. What he doesn't know is that Mum is getting on the bus, and that's where all the vibrations are coming from, because Mum has to go to the shop and buy food so that baby has enough food. Furthermore, she's going to the shop to buy things for the baby's room so that the baby has a cot and everything when he's born. But the baby in the womb is too small to understand what's going on. Now look at that picture, the baby's in the womb. Look how big the baby is compared to the mum. Now think about us compared to God. How small are we compared to God? tiny, right? So how much can we really understand of how God is in control of everything in the world? It's hard for us to get a grasp on it. What we can do is we can say, this is what God's revealed in the Bible. We're going to believe him on it. We're going to try to understand it, but it can be hard for us to understand because we are small, finite human beings. Now, this stuff that I've just explained is basically called compatibilism. Compatibilism is where you say it's compatible that God is in control of everything and that we are responsible for what we do, and that what we do actually has ramifications. There's actually results from what we do. That's called compatibilism. Now, it's also called Reformed theology, and it can be called, it's part of Reformed theology, and it can be called Calvinism, but Calvinism sometimes means different things to different people. So Wayne Grudem was once asked at his church, how many points of Calvinism do you adhere to? And he said, if I got you to all write on a piece of paper what you think Calvinism is, there'd be 100 different definitions. So I'm letting you know this is part of what Calvinism is, but you might have a different idea of what Calvinism is to me. And so it's not always a helpful term. But in your teacher's guide, there's lots more stuff about this under the for further study stuff. So I've put in a lot of stuff there to help you if you want to wrestle through some of this stuff. But now what I want you to do is work through the application questions. So this is where the rubber hits the road, really. Oh, there's also a video there, Essential Sovereignty of God. You might find that helpful. But first question is, can you think of any examples of good coming out of bad in your life? We've all got examples of that, right? Next question is, do you understand that when bad things have happened in your life, even though God has been in control and has a purpose in these things, they have still made God sad? Next question, can you think of times when you've wanted something and you didn't get it, but it turned out for good that you didn't get it? And then the last application question, some people mistakenly underemphasize God's sovereignty. Others underemphasize human responsibility. Which side do you tend to err on? When it says God's sovereignty there, that's the phrase we use for God being in control of everything. And there's an illustration here to make this point. What do you call one of those things, by the way? You call it a life what? A life ring? You call it a life ring? Maybe that's what it's called. We've been asking people for 18 months what it is, and everyone's like, it's a life, no one knows what it's called. Maybe you guys have the answer. It's a life ring. Okay. There's some people on a boat, right? And there's two men standing there looking over the side, and then they see a man fall overboard. And the first man says, if it's God's will to save him, he will save him, and does nothing. The second man says, it may be God's will to save him, and he's going to save him through the means of me jumping over and saving him. So, or not jumping over, but throwing him a life ring. So then he throws a life ring to the guy in the water. Which of those guys is a compatibilist? The second guy. The first guy is a what? A fatalist, or when I took a former Muslim guy through this, he said, that's a Muslim. Yeah? You've got to understand, right? You've got to understand the sovereignty of God, this doctrine, yeah, or what I'm calling compatibilism, has been distorted in Islam and has become something called fatalism, which is where whatever Allah wills, you know, it's all Allah. I didn't do that bad thing to you. That was God. You know, I'm not responsible. Or even, I'm not going to get up in the morning because God's going to do what he wants anyway, so I just lie in bed. That's what's called fatalism, and that's a distortion of compatibilism or Calvinism or Reformed theology. Now, there is a group of Calvinists called hyper-Calvinists who they don't preach the gospel to people who don't show signs of regeneration. They don't do a lot of evangelism. That would be a sign of taking this to the extreme and saying, God's going to save him, he'll do it. We say, if God's going to save him, he saves him through means. Paul says that in Acts, Corinthians, a Jew to the Greek, a Jew to the Jews, a Greek to the Greek, so that I may, what does it say? All things to all people, so that I may save some by any means. So Paul understood there were means through which God saves people. So that's in genuine Reformed theology. That's what we're talking about. So go through those questions. And that last one is a real interesting one to find out about yourself. do you tend to underemphasize God's sovereignty? So in other words, if you're someone who panics and you're like, I've got to do this, it's all on me, and you stay up all night getting it done because otherwise the world's going to stop spinning, you underemphasize God's sovereignty. But if you're a person who underemphasizes human responsibility, then you're not responsible with many areas of your life. And sometimes you say, well, God will do what he wants. And that's not actually a balanced view. But we all in this room will find that we tend to err on one side or the other. And it's helpful to know that, because then you can start asking God for the grace to deal with that. So if you can now do these questions together and then finish by praying.